With countless episodes under its belt at this point, it's basically a given that there would be a few episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants that would end up reflecting the modern world and have something important to say about it. I even covered one of the most relevant episodes of the show in another video, which you can find a link in the description to. But that being said, there is another episode that, intentionally or not, perfectly covers the rising threat of artificial intelligence and the problems that will inevitably come with it. And today, I'd like to go over this episode and specifically how right it actually is. And needless to say, there are going to be spoilers ahead, so in case you'd like to see this episode for yourself first and draw your own conclusions from it, you probably know what you should do at this point. Okay, so just like in the aforementioned video, the episode in question here is surprisingly not from the golden age of SpongeBob, but rather the season 15 episode, Smartificial Intelligence. And just for those of you who haven't seen it, the episode centers around everyone's favorite Bikini Bottom news reporter, Perch Perkins, being replaced at his job by a robot lookalike, even having the very hair ripped off his head in order to complete the look. But SpongeBob, being as loyal as ever, decides to track down Perch and help him out, finding him in Old Reporters Row, an old alley littered with half-insane reporters who've similarly lost their jobs to robots and are now left homeless. From there, SpongeBob tries to convince Perch Perkins to get a different job, and though that initially seems to work, his penchant for interviewing people instead of getting to the task at hand keeps getting him fired. So running low on options, SpongeBob decides that the best thing they can do is get him his old job back, and manages to convince the head of the news station to give him a chance despite Perkins' own doubts. So Perch and Newsbot, as his replacement is called, engage in a news-off, which basically means that whoever reports the most news wins and gets to keep reporting. However, things go off the rails when Perch Perkins realizes that Newsbot is deliberately causing mayhem and destruction so that he'll have more news stories to report, causing the robot to self-destruct when it's called out on it, and for Perch to get his old job back, having proven himself to be the better and more ethical reporter. Now, like I said at the start, whether or not this episode is intentionally setting itself up as a commentary on artificial intelligence or not is irrelevant, because it ends up having some pretty important things to say regardless. Though before I get into that, I'd just like to point out that the moment where they literally rip Perch Perkins' hair off and put it on the robot because, quote, the hair belongs to the studio, is actually a pretty accurate yet sad take on how corporations will sometimes get people to literally sign over ownership of things they have no business to as their own, such as names, a voice, or even their hair. In other words, it was probably written to be just a meaningless gag, but it still ends up making a pretty good point regardless. But to get into the meat of the episode, the premise itself is one that's already started to come to fruition in the real world, the fear of being replaced at your job by artificial intelligence. But this episode is arguably ahead of the curve in not only depicting that, but showing why it'll ultimately be a bad thing when it does happen. Because first of all, SpongeBob's whole motivation for wanting to help Perch Perkins stems from the fact that he's formed a genuine bond with him after spending years watching him report the news, because he's what made the news fun to watch. And it is true. In the real world, a robot may be able to report the news as easily as a human being, but all they're going to do is state facts. They can't give opinions, they can't emote along with the viewing audience, or genuinely connect with them. So it would all come across as very cold and sterile. In all honesty, those who watch the news usually do these days because of the reporters. Even if they usually maintain a professional demeanor, they all have their own distinct personalities, quirks, and opinions to add, because in the end, they're just as human as the people watching are, and thus are able to connect with them in ways that a machine simply wouldn't be able to. And this is something that SpongeBob understands right out of the gate. He knows that a robot can't replace Perch no matter how much it's been programmed to look like him, and thus sticks up for him when no one else will. But where this episode is also very smart is in how it depicts Perch's attempts to get a new job, because most of the time, when confronted with the inevitability of machines taking away jobs, experts always propose that people will be able to get jobs that involve the very machines that replace them, kind of like what happens in the 2005 version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Because at first, Charlie's dad works in a toothpaste factory screwing caps on the tubes, but then loses his job after the company replaces him with a machine. But in the end, their problems are solved when he gets a new job fixing the same machine that got him fired. But while that may work for some people, Smartificial Intelligence shows what happens to those who can't make such an easy transition. Because as Perch Perkins himself notes, all he knows how to do is hold a microphone, ask questions, state facts, and be very charismatic while doing it. And while he does try his hand at similar jobs that involve him speaking to people, ultimately his old habits and talents inevitably get in the way. In other words, as anybody who's ever been fired unfortunately knows, it's not that easy finding a job in a different line of work, and that the longer one has been at their previous job, the harder getting a new one will be. And that's exactly what happens to Perkins. Because his inability to get a new job, as well as all the reporters left to rot on Old Reporters Row, paint a scarily accurate picture of what will happen to most people if they're replaced by machines. Because like it or not, most simply don't have the skills, talents, or training to get a new job in a completely different field, especially if the new job requires completely different skills than the old one did. And then there's the news off itself, which is what finally gets Perch his job back. Because while it may seem silly at first for a robot to start making its own news when it has none left to report, that's actually more accurate than most people would think. Because as I already explained in my video on Auto from WALL-E, which you can also find a link in the description to, when most AI is given a program, they have to follow that order to completion no matter what. As the Terminator is famously described, it absolutely will not stop, no matter what, until either the order is carried out to the letter or it's rescinded. And not only is that in and of itself a problem, but it can only understand the letter of an order, not the spirit. So if you give a robot the order to report more news than somebody else, and that other person starts to get the upper hand, as he does in the episode, then it's not out of the realm of possibility that it would start deliberately causing problems in order to have more news to report. Because again, it's following the letter of its programming by reporting more news, but in spirit it's gone completely against what it's supposed to be doing. And needless to say, that's one of the biggest problems with artificial intelligence on the whole, because it's programmed to follow any order it's given to completion, even ones its creators might not have thought of and thus isn't programmed to carry out correctly, and no amount of reasoning will ever get it to stop. It can quickly cause unforeseen problems when it goes to extreme lengths to carry out its directives, just as Auto does in WALL-E and Newsbot does here. And despite being depicted that way in multiple media across entertainment, that's actually one of the more overlooked problems surrounding AI. And as I brought up in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to, may just be what causes AI to turn on its creators. The fact that said creators aren't extremely careful when programming it. Because let's face it, Newsbot is outright shown hurting multiple people in order to carry out his orders, and could have even gotten others killed if Perch hadn't stopped him when he did. As I even spoke about in the aforementioned video, AI can be extremely dangerous even beyond just stealing people's jobs, and the climax of this episode shows exactly how. But despite having a happy ending with Perch Perkins getting his job back, the episode is actually pretty cynical with the way it goes about portraying all of this, particularly in how all of the focus is placed on Perch Perkins being replaced by a robot and the various attempts by Spongebob to help him, while everybody else's struggles with losing their jobs to AI are totally ignored, because 3 times throughout the episode other characters are shown to be replaced by robots, specifically the reporters in Old Reporters Row, Patrick during SpongeBob's one-man protest, and the head of the news station himself at the end of the episode. And again, the fact that none of these characters, nor the fact that they've suffered the exact same fate Perch Perkins had, are ever brought up reflects another harsh reality about the rise of AI. That despite people's resistance to it, in the end they only try to stop it where it suits them, and that it'll still creep into everything in the long run because they don't care enough to stop robots from overrunning everything, just whatever they personally care about and are attached to, as SpongeBob is to Perch in the episode. Because he's so focused on him, he doesn't bother to help anybody else suffering from the same problem. He even outright says you can't just replace somebody with a machine, and then proceeds to do just that with a robot he made of Patrick. So in the end, getting Perkins his job back is only a small victory in a larger issue that he doesn't seem too interested in solving, exactly how many in the real world are apt to behave. Now once again, whether or not most of this was actually intentional on the writer's part is hard to say, as a lot of it simply comes across as just trying to be funny. But regardless of that, Smartificial Intelligence still ends up having some very important things to say about AI and where it's all heading if people act like SpongeBob and only attack it where it hurts them and not address the wider issues surrounding it, as well as companies not being able to see the bigger picture of why replacing people with robots in many positions could end up backfiring in the long run, just as the station Perch Perkins reports for comes to say. Because while replacing a man who simply recites the news with a machine they don't have to pay might sound like a good proposition at first, in the end it proves to be way more trouble than it's worth, and that's not even getting into what poor Perch has to go through as a result of getting fired. Overall, it's just not a good thing for anyone all around. Obviously, there are better alternatives, but I'm not here to give real-world commentaries. So all I'll say is, if people don't learn from the lessons this episode imparts, then many are doomed to go down the same path as it. And they probably won't be as lucky as SpongeBob or Perch Perkins when that time inevitably comes either. Okay, I think I've gone on about this for long enough, so now I'd like to hear your opinions. Do you believe that the SpongeBob SquarePants episode Smartificial Intelligence is an excellent cautionary tale on the dangers of AI and people's generally apathetic attitude towards it and those who suffer as a result of it? Or do you believe it was simply a bad episode that didn't have anything important to say at all? Please let me know in the comments below. And please keep in mind that any and all opinions expressed here are simply that, opinions. And you don't have to agree with any of them if you don't want to. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.